what is the point of being a journalist? All they're going to do is sort of decorate power, which is what they think they're doing.
So welcome, Peter Oborne, to the first James J. Dart Book Club Q&A. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you speak to us today. So for those who perhaps don't know who you are, most people I think who on my platform will know who you are. They've probably followed your work, followed your commentary recently, particularly on what we're going to be talking about today, The Assault on Truth, which is your superb book, which if you haven't read, anybody watching this who hasn't read this, buy a copy. It's brilliant. It should be compulsory reading, in my opinion. And obviously we're going to get into all of that just now. So I wanted to start off by asking you about Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. So that's the subtitle of the book, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and the Emergence of a New Moral Barbarism. Is Boris Johnson the worst offender we've seen in the post-war period?
In British politics,
yeah,
Boris Johnson is the most flagrant and serious and habitual liar that I would actually say, not just in the post-war period. I think ever. You know, I certainly going back to. I can't think of any precedent as a prime minister going back to Walpole for the kind of fabrication and so on we see from. I mean, Tony Blair is the nearest example in the sense that he was responsible, although he denies it, for a terrible lie, but it was, in my view, a lie, weapons of mass destruction, which was the fabricated excuse, admittedly aided and abetted by MI6, and that makes a difference. Aided and abetted by the intelligence services to provide the justification for an illegal war, which with utterly calamitous consequences, which are still being felt, including the rise of IS and domestic blowback terrorism in Britain, and really hundreds of thousands of knock-on deaths. I mean, nothing which Mr. Johnson has done has had such desperate, awful consequences. But in terms of the methodology of lying, and the frequency of it, Johnson's in a different dimension to Blair. Yeah,
and of course you wrote a book, The Rise of Political Lying, in 2005 about New Labour and Tony Blair's lying. So it's not like anybody on the left or the right could accuse you of being particularly biased one way or the other. You've covered lying across the spectrum, really, haven't you?
Yes, I mean, I was so shocked. I couldn't believe that a British Prime Minister would lie about something as serious as weapons of mass destruction, although I do reiterate that Mr. Blair himself would deny that's a lie, and so would his, that I wrote that book, and it meant that when Mr. Johnson became Prime Minister, I almost felt an obligation. In fact, I did feel an obligation to write this book, The Assault on Truth, because I knew I was uniquely equipped to be able to do it, because I hadn't just chronicled Blair's lies, I'd really thought about what political lying was and what it meant. So it gave me a real good background to writing the book, as well as the fact that I knew Boris Johnson. And
of course, he was your boss, right, at The Spectator. He hired you. Yeah. And in the book, you sort of, in the later chapters, you kind of have, it's almost like you're grappling with yourself, trying to unpick how maybe you missed the sort of Boris Johnson of 2019, 2020, 2021, because you describe him as sort of a brilliant journalist, charismatic, a good boss. And then the Boris Johnson of this kind of populist era you describe as almost like an alien, somebody that you don't recognize. Have you found any more movement on that since writing the book?
No, I think you're right. I had to reconcile the person I worked for, who was very straightforward as far as I was concerned, and really had a very complex understanding of politics, including the European Union. with the figure which emerged particularly after he went to the Foreign Office, and then ran for the Tory leadership, and then became Prime Minister. And actually, it was becoming Prime Minister which was so extraordinary, when he immediately captured and abused the kind of the power of Downing Street to create malicious fabrications about political rivals. You literally turned the Downing Street press power into a force to spread lies. And that was very horrifying, because nobody had done that before.
It's interesting because on my platform, I've often spoken about 2016 being a kind of watershed moment, and particularly the Vote Leave campaign, which I watched. I'm sure you've seen it, the documentary on Netflix about Roger Stone, Get Me Roger Stone, and Roger. Oh, you haven't? That's definitely worth having a look at. I'm sure you're familiar with Roger Stone, though, and in that it sort of chronicles how Roger Stone's influence on the Republican Party, and how his kind of really cynical anti-politics, corrupting of the Republican Party, sort of opened the door for Trump. And I view 2016's Vote Leave campaign as very kind of Roger Stone-esque. And we've known now that Boris Johnson's been in close contact with people like Steve Bannon and people. So I wonder if there was ever a hint with Boris Johnson, going back to the days when you knew him, that he was capable of going down that kind of darker, cynical, anti-politics, populist route? Or was it just, he was an opportunist and he just saw an opportunity in the moment?
My view is, you see, the Johnson who was editor of The Spectator and then went on to become London mayor was a kind of liberal, cosmopolitan figure. And he was almost in many ways ideologically the opposite of what he has become in Downing Street.
Yeah.
And actually, although he wasn't part of any clique inside the Tory party the way, say, Michael Gove was, he wasn't a modernizer. But it's part of this very interesting trajectory of the so-called Tory modernizers of that time. One thinks of Gove and Policy Exchange and people like Nick Bowles, and this movement which coalesced around David Cameron for a little while. It was optimistic, it was green, and it turned the one thing it was against was sort of ideological discourse around Europe or immigration. It was quite the opposite to that. And Johnson's Spectator was roughly alongside that kind of set of ideas. And he certainly was himself, and that's how he sold himself, I think I'm right in saying, to London. And so then to find Johnson now, attacking to the alt-right, and has been for some time, is how do you explain these two completely different figures? And the same, of course, would be true of Michael Gove, who moves from being a sort of, little Lord Fauntleroy sort of Tory modernizer, hello clouds, hello flowers type, to this very dark figure who's associated with the far right movements and the transatlantic. And I do agree that it must be Vote Leave which released a lot of that.
Yeah. In the book, you say that both Boris Johnson and Donald Trump prey on the dark side of human nature. I won't spend too much longer on Boris Johnson, but I wanted to just talk to you about that a little bit. What did you mean by that, prey on the dark side of human nature? Because you do spend a little bit of time in the book talking about what a sort of a conservative in your mind is or was, and we'll come on to that in a minute. We've got a bit about the capture of the Conservative Party, but why did you say that they prey on the dark side of human nature? What did you mean by that? Because
it's truer of Trump than Johnson.
Yeah.
But because I wrote a book about Trump's tweets, Trump's political language.
Yeah.
and it was very shocking. I hadn't kind of realized until I started studying Trump how dark he was, that he is really channeling fascist, really genocidal movements in some cases.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And I hadn't realized that, the white supremacist, because actually we're rather naive in this country. We've made assumptions about people having good motives and something. And Trump's, a lot of his tweets, I wrote it just after he became president. And the research told you how manipulative and how frightening it was. And it's a humanity. I mean, liberals have a benign vision of humanity. They think human beings are essentially good. Conservatives think, and that I can think that human beings are essentially flawed, and that for which brings two different kinds of political approach. But Trump knows that flawed, and whereas conventional conservatives see, because of they react to the flawed nature of humanity and human society by setting up a series of institutional prophylactics against that darkness which we all have within us.
Yeah.
Trump directly appeals to that darkness, and so I'm afraid a great deal of the time is Johnson.
Yeah. Have you read the
racist comments and pleasant alliances? Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, have you read Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature?
Gosh, you're so much better read than I am. You keep on asking me to read books.
It's
I
a
better
brilliant,
write that one down too. Yeah.
It's a really top read. It's he charts the kind of like the building blocks that allow humans to be the best versions of themselves, and institutions. There's a whole chapter dedicated to institutions in that. And I just have this image of Donald Trump reading that and just thinking, I'll see to that. Just like,
yeah, and that's what Johnson has done. You see, what Johnson has done in office is to take on and seek to destroy every institution which Britain has. That's the civil service, which is the corporate memory of the British state. It sought to destroy the rule of law. He keeps on, even announcing he's going to break the law. I mean, it's
crazy.
And these very ugly attacks on the law, on judges. Then the very cynical and manipulative approach to the monarchy, which what he's doing is trying to take away the symbolism of the monarchy and give it to himself. This is clearly a very deep strategy. I'd love to know. I haven't worked out where it's coming from, and so on. It's a very now whether this is conscious Johnson or whether it's being framed, I presume it's not actually. I just don't think he's got that kind of intellectual analysis within him, but some of his advisors are obviously doing this.
Yeah, for sure. I want to move on to something else you talk about in the book, is how there used to be just very, very high levels of integrity in public life. And people in positions of power, elected members, would resign for things that, 10 years ago, we would all pretty much agree were resignable offences. So my question is, why don't these current ministers resign? And tacked onto that question is, the Nolan principles, do they count for anything anymore?
Well, there's two separate. First of all, it's two separate questions. Let's start with Nolan, which don't count for anything. They're being systematically ignored. And there was big clues to that from Johnson before he became prime minister. He was, he repeatedly failed to declare his interests and where he was getting money from and so on. So there was a sort of habitual. The rules didn't apply to him, but the Nolan principles under Johnson have been systematically ignored. There's a very good article in Political Quarterly by Professor Leighton Andrews, I think he was, where I first realized, well, we set this out very well, which I then, as political journalists do, could have plagiarized with credit. I gave him the credit, but it's very fascinating. Openness, accountability, integrity, all of the 7 principles, which are almost scriptural in their sort of intent, have all been dumped. To be fair again to Mr. Johnson, I don't think it was him who started this. Tony Blair dumped quite a few of them. Theresa May, 1 or 2 of them, although essentially she was quite honest. But Johnson, they don't apply at all. He's in permanent breach of the ministerial code, and it doesn't apply. I don't see how the cabinet secretaries, it raises big questions about the cabinet secretary, Simon Case, that he's permitting this to happen.
And I guess the reason why I put those two together was because of the Priti Patel bullying report incident, where it looked as though when this came out that maybe she would be forced to resign. And actually what happened was the opposite, where there was just this extreme doubling down, where all the ministers, all the MPs were basically told to go out and defend Priti Patel and talk about how brilliant she'd been. Of course, she'd been sacked before for breaching the ministerial code. So this was a second offence, but this time round, she didn't resign because the people who were her bosses were Johnson and co. So there was a definite difference there in terms of the respect for the Nolan principles.
Yeah, let's distinguish between resigning and sacking. So Theresa May forced the resignation or sacked Gavin Williamson after a report. I think after she was advised that he'd leaked secret conversations. Yeah. I think I'm not 100% certain I got that exactly right.
Yeah, I think I remember that. Yeah,
and off he went into the outer darkness. And then Priti Patel, she went to Israel and had a whole series of meetings while she was on holiday, which she didn't declare to, as she should probably have done. And I think she resigned in the relationship. You're right. And then, as you say, she repeated this, or let's be careful with our language. I haven't got the details. She allegedly bullied subordinates, and Alex Allen, the ethics chief, wanted her, wrote a very hostile report, and Johnson's response was rally round the Pritster.
That's right, yeah.
As he called her. And it was a big statement, actually, that he couldn't give a damn about the rules. And it troubles me about the Conservative Party, that it's happy to have to go along with this contempt for basic ordinary rules which have governed British public life, certainly since the mid-19th century.
And this actually brings us on nicely to the next part then, which is about, in your book, you've got a whole chapter dedicated to the capture of the Conservative Party. So my question is the Conservative Party still a Conservative Party?
Not in the, there's always a distinction between right wing and conservative. And it's a right wing party in many ways, although it has certain left wing characteristics, massive public spending. But it's right wing in conservatism in its traditional sense, as set out by the two great conservative philosophers. There are not very many of them, unlike Labour, which the left has lots of conservative philosophers of one kind or another. Conservatives are rather proud of the fact they don't really have any, but apart from Edmund Burke, who was really a Whig, to start with, an Irish anti-colonial, but he wrote his famous treatise about the French Revolution and warned that you get rid of institutions, you would unleash all sorts of the darkness in people's souls, and so he predicted the terror. And his great point was that these institutions that represent the wisdom of the ages and the wisdom of past generations and you preserve them for future generations, and if you tear them up, unleash all sorts of horrors. He was really the founding father of conservatism, and the British Conservative Party emerged in the aftermath of the French Revolution. That was the convulsive event of the age, was the French Revolution.
Yeah, we were terrified of it.
And the Conservative Party emerged in the 1820s. The phrase conservative is first used in the 1820s, just after the Napoleonic Wars are finished. And then Michael Oakeshott in the 20th century, sort of a Donish figure, who, I think at Key's, Cambridge, and then at London University, set out a version of this kind of conservatism, a warning of the dangers of grand political ideas. And that's basically the only two conservative political philosophers we've had, with the exception maybe of Roger Scruton, who is quite sinister. He takes the Conservatives in a Hegelian direction. And although he wrote very well and beautifully, and I greatly admired him, some of his later pronouncements and then about take us in quite dark directions, I think, about Islam and so on. So those are the two, and what Johnson and Trump both did is to rip up that institutional that belief, conservative belief in institutions and in due process, truth-telling, obeying the law, basic human courtesy and kindness as well.
Yeah.
And just moved it into a look. Both of them looked and deliberately constructed a direct relationship between the political leader, which bypasses institutions, with voters.
Yeah.
And that is precisely what the conservative philosophers, Montesquieu is the classic balance of powers. You create the French philosopher Montesquieu, the idea that you have a structure of balance of powers and revising chambers which mitigate against the power of the mob. And basically Johnson and Trump both basically appeal quite deliberately so as a political strategy, and in both cases very successfully, to the mob. Yeah.
And would you say that Johnson, Trump, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Oborne, they've all sussed out that in the social media and internet age, you can bypass accountability in a way that you couldn't do 20 years ago by going straight to the mob, as you say. Very easily, you can, if you've got billions as well, you can hyper target people like Vote Leave did in 2016 with very cynical ads that actually no one other than the people viewing them can see, because you can hide them in many cases as well. So what would you say, the age of the internet and particularly social media, how has social media, I'm perhaps you're not an expert on this, but you touched on it a little bit in the book. How would you say social media has sort of aided the rise of a sort of populist right?
Yeah, I'm not really competent to answer that. I did touch on it, but
a little bit, yeah,
I didn't have the knowledge and the understanding to give a good answer, because there's no question that a lot of these techniques were used over Facebook.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And Twitter less so. I mean, Twitter's a different sort of discourse, isn't it? I'm sure you're right. And I've read Peter Pomerantse's book. I did read about the very deliberate manipulation of social media in order to obtain Duterte is a brilliant case in point he gives, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very, very conscious, deliberate, knowing manipulation of quite local discourses in order to win political arguments and create dividing lines which weren't there before.
Yeah, for sure. And Oborne in Hungary as well, apparently, has been very.
Yeah, now Oborne, who's coming to London, isn't he? Very interesting.
Yeah.
There's a writer on the New Statesman called Cliff who wrote a very interesting comparison between Johnson and Orbán, clientelistic, to use the academic term, big spending, very dark in terms of its cultural narratives, certainly on minorities.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that there's major comparisons that can be drawn between Boris Johnson and Orbán, sadly. So I wanted to ask you, in the book you say that the sort of informal motto really of the Conservative Party these days is whatever it takes, which I guess is a kind of shorthand for the ends justify the means. And then you spend a little bit of time in the book sort of saying that actually traditionally this was more of a left-wing thing. I'm not entirely sure. That's been my experience of the sort of progressive space. But why? How did we get to a situation where this kind of whatever it takes motto has kind of overtaken and infected the Conservative Party? Is it literally the case that it was Dominic Cummings in 2016 who sort of the Vote Leave mob have taken over, and that was kind of it was them lot? Have they purged the moderates? Is that what's happened?
I think that it's the same territory. Answering this involves going into the same territory as we were talking about before, which is, well, yeah, the end justifies the means, which is the Leninist dictum. That's what I argued, is that the left enfranchises itself from normal rules because it believes its virtue is so great and the banality of its enemies is so terrible and they're so unscrupulous that it's justified in lying and in violence in some cases and so on. Whereas the right, because it doesn't believe in grand political visions, is much nicer, more fastidious about its methods. That is the justification for the traditional kind. Yeah. I know that people on the left disagree with that, but I think it's quite a profound point.
Yeah.
And what is the key point about Trump and Johnson is that they don't have any benign vision, really. But what they are delighted to do is to renounce the prophylactics used by the right against by traditional conservatism against barbarism, and we're seeing the same problem in the post-Trump Republican Party, aren't we? That Trump may have left office, but he's not. But his effect on the Republicans is very profound still.
Indeed, it was very cult-like. I was reading an article in the Washington Post, I think last week, which was saying that Eric Trump, his son, is regarded, I think, as the number 3 choice behind Donald and then someone else for the leader of the Republican Party. So there's a serious cult-like element to what's going on in that party. Fortunately, Boris Johnson doesn't have any political kids that we know about who are sort of up and coming. But so my next question is about Dominic Cummings. Obviously, the revelations that happened yesterday, in which he said that firstly he accused Matt Hancock of lying about the care home situation. He said that he himself didn't tell the full truth about the Barnard Castle situation. And he went on to say that he definitely didn't think that Boris Johnson was fit to be the Prime Minister. So I guess my question is, how does the Conservative Party, where does it go next? You've got the two of the most sort of loved in a weird kind of way, Cummings and Johnson, sort of going at one another, goes, I guess, kind of sitting back and seeing where the cards fall, I guess. But where does the Conservative Party go from here?
I suppose that this is Cummings is fascinating and quite compelling discourse yesterday. Will be seen as some as just sort of sour grapes, and this is where it will be presented as a personal attack by a disappointed courtier.
Yeah, that's how the Telegraph and the Mail covered it this morning, didn't they?
The Mail covered it that way, did they?
Yeah.
What about the Sun? I expect the Sun to.
I didn't see the Sun, but I saw.
Yeah, but the three big newspaper groups on the right broadly speaking, do that. I don't think it's possible because to make that work, because Cummings was, after all, the right-hand man, the senior advisor to the Prime Minister for about a year, including during the early months when great mistakes were made over the COVID pandemic. And I think what he says has to be taken very seriously. And I think he was quite strategically sensible to own up to his own errors as well. He has a history of turning on people he worked for. Ian Duncan Smith, he did the same. They're not in such a dramatic way. Where did the Conservative Party go from here? I think the question is Johnson more than, I mean, what Cummings has done is dropped a whole series of devastating remarks about Boris Johnson's style of leadership and the integrity of, in particular, Matt Hancock, who seems to be bang to rights on the care homes issue, actually. We've known that for a long time.
Yeah.
I think that the Tory party has a very, does it want to pursue this route, the demagogic route, which we have with Johnson. Johnson is a sort of British Oborne, maybe Berlusconi is has touches of that, with complete contempt for rule breaking, these very troubling relationships with the media, the complete neglect of any moral standards, financially greedy. There is a sort of element, yet a sort of great performer who has entranced quite a large section of the electorate.
Yeah.
And of course, eventually, did Berlusconi go to jail? I can't remember, but he certainly had difficulties with the police, didn't he? That's something which could happen to Johnson. I mean, there are so many inquiries into his conduct, his relationship with donors, a vast number now of unanswered questions.
Yeah.
And he persistently and repeatedly lies about everything, including on the floor of the House. Now, does the Tory party go on tolerating Johnson? And that is really, this isn't simply a question for ordinary Tory voters, perhaps less of a question for them than it is for Rishi Sunak and cabinet ministers, who, how do they kind of justify being in the same government as somebody who behaves like that?
Indeed. And I was going to say as well, like in the book, you sort of say that these people that are perhaps not as habitually lying in the same way that Johnson is, they're having to lie on his behalf because he's such a liar that then when he says something that's untrue, they then have to go out and defend him. So a lot of the people
can't say it's untrue because then they would have to resign, I suppose, something like that, and they'd be punished, and so that price they are paying for being a cabinet minister and having power, which is what politicians crave, is to go along with lies, falsehood, what is looking cronyism, sleaze, potentially corruption.
Yeah. I want to move on to the British press, because this is something that a lot of people in the sort of progressive space, of which I'm part, talk about a lot, and we feel very frustrated, I think, because we just don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. In the book, obviously, you're fairly polemical about the state of the British press at the moment. I think particularly the right. I don't think you mention. I mean, actually, no, you do mention specific papers, but I wanted to ask you about the chumminess of people in the British press, because obviously we talk about the sort of revolving door and the fact that they have to negotiate this kind of access to politicians, and I guess in a way you sort of say that you pay a price because then I think the example you give is Beth Rigby of Sky, who in one of Boris Johnson's earliest press conferences, she asked some hard questions, and then it almost cost her job at Sky, because she was no longer getting interviews with the government and so on, because they take away that access. They punish you. It's kind of like almost like puppy training in a way, isn't it? Like you get rewarded for doing the right things and punished for doing the wrong things. So can you be on the right, particularly in the British press these days, and not be part of the kind of government machine, as it were?
Can you see, like, for the first time in about 2 months, the sun's just come out.
Yeah.
Which is really good news, but
Indeed, finally.
Let me just move along a bit. Well, I think that what we've seen is the emergence of a new class. Well, there's always been strong elements of this, but of a class of journalists which sees themselves as simply mouthpieces for the regime. Sorry, that's the wrong phrase, the government. It is an elected government. And it's quite embarrassing. Well, journalists ought to be there to try and sort of put both sides of the story, find your own truth. I mean, the truth, not your own truth, the truth. And write balanced pieces for an intelligent audience, instead of what's happened. And it isn't just true of political journalism, it's true of a lot of public life as well, that we know we're expected to take a side all the time. And if you don't do that, you're accused of being inconsistent, and your enemies are accused of being venal, because both sides hate each other so much. This is really divisive and awful, and it's something's gone wrong with the public square in not just in Britain, but in America and elsewhere. I do think, and some of the journalists are frankly pathetic. What is the point of being a journalist if all you're going to do is sort of decorate power, which is what they think they're doing? I'm very interested what happened. A paper I used to write for the Daily Mail, which was still is in many ways, very pro Johnson, but Simon Walters, I've worked with on and off for 30 years, and is a friend of mine. He's produced these series of really interesting, important stories about Downing Street sleaze, about the most recent one, I think, was Lord Bamford providing 28,000 quid worth of free for meals for the Prime Minister in the last year, something like that.
Yeah.
28,000. Then we had the wallpaper, which is whether there are several investigations.
Yeah, the holiday in Martinique, wherever it was.
The holiday in Martinique, where the Standards Commissioner thinks that Mr. Johnson was in breach.
Yeah.
This is all. I mean, this is what these three stories have in common. Is the Prime Minister apparently taking services or goods or free holidays, which place him in a form of, he owes, doesn't he? He owes. These rich men don't give you money for nothing.
No.
They give you money because they want you to owe them favors. And I think there are, and so that is good old-fashioned journalism. It does annoy me, the discourse, particularly on the left. You know, what's Lord Rothermere up to, and you know, why is the Mail turned against Boris Johnson? That's bollocks. They haven't done that. They just, Sam Walters is just a very good journalist doing what journalists should do, which is publishing stuff which, in the words, I think, of Lord Northcliffe, the founder of the Daily Mail, said that news is something that somebody somewhere doesn't want printed.
Yeah.
Whereas most of these creatures out there in the modern lobby, their idea of news is to put something out there which Downing Street does want printed, you know, some later. Yeah. And so free cheers for Mr. Walters. He's quite unusual, but I hope others will follow his
your characterization, I think, on the call I saw you on last time, where you said there was an outbreak of journalism, the Mail.
Yeah, that's it.
I thought that was a funny way of putting it. So I wanted to ask you, I guess you've just covered this actually, but does the truth play second, third, fourth fiddle to other interests now? I guess you've just covered that, but in the book, obviously, you talk about the fact that you've got other agendas, and the reason that you left the you resigned your position at the Telegraph. Was it 2015 you did that?
Yes.
Was because of the situation with HSBC, and you discovered that the Telegraph was taking a sympathetic line on the HSBC because they were a big donor or a big backer of the Telegraph. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I couldn't get a story published because it emerged that HSBC didn't want. Well, there were worries that HSBC might be upset by it.
Yeah.
That wasn't the only case in point for HSBC and other corporate interests, and indeed foreign powers. The stuff which the Telegraph didn't run because they didn't want to upset people. And I felt that was unfortunate. I just felt that was wrong, actually.
Yeah. At the risk of sounding like a kind of loony lefty, I wonder if these kind of alt media sources that are kind of backed by people and funded by small donations from the public, which hasn't got the same kind of corporate pressure, are the future? Can they make inroads into the mainstream?
I really hope so. I think you're exactly right that we're going to have to look to outlets which you can trust. Now, it's not just the right which has donors or owners who have motives. So the same is true in the left. Some of them, they are tied into institutional structures too. But I think that there is a stretching towards a new form of journalism, isn't there? And particularly on the left, where people come together. There are on the right too. There are these websites. I always like to know a bit more about who owns them.
Yeah,
it is quite important.
Yeah,
and quite often it's not as clear as all that.
No, and it's quite often the assumption sometimes is that it's people power, and actually it turns out that it's some shady billionaire or something, one of the Koch brothers or something. But because prior to being a teacher, I worked in social media, and part of what I did was to monitor and research a lot of what was going on in the alt-right space. So it was interesting to sort of sniff around in that environment, and not particularly good for my mental health, I have to say either.
No, it isn't good, is it? Because you go slightly mad if you spend too much time in social media, don't you? It's not very good for you.
No, it's not. Absolutely, yeah. So I've recently bought a kitten and a puppy to try and offset some of that a little bit.
Yes, well, maybe you should do some rock climbing or
bit of exercise.
Yeah. I think you need to cultivate an allotment is very good.
No, there's some good sound advice. So finally on. Go on, what did you say? Sorry.
Take up. Sport is another thing which does you a bit of good, I think.
Yeah. I play.
In my case, cricket.
Cricket. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. We've finally got a bit of weather for cricket because May's been a write off.
I know. It's just wonderful. This sun, which I'm staring at it all day.
Yeah. I'm feeling guilty now, keeping you inside when you probably want to go out. So I'll wrap this up then, because you probably want to shoot off soon. So I just wanted to ask you. I hope this is not inappropriate, but in the book you basically said that your sort of journalistic career in the mainstream is kind of over by virtue of the choices you've made in kind of basically having integrity and calling out what the sort of institutional problems in the mainstream press in Britain are. So I guess my question is your career actually over, or will the press get back to a stage where your integrity and your view of how the press ought to work will be the norm again?
I think there are much bigger questions facing British society, which is adjacent to that, which are, if you look at the Conservative Party, the government, you can see that it's been taken over by rich men who basically control government policy. It's lost its connection with ordinary activists. And you could see the same with all sorts of other institutions, not all of them, which have allowed themselves to be deeply compromised. And the reasons are often reasons, and I like to think I've stayed in exactly the same place politically, but some people would say I gone to the left. Big money has become too pervasive.
Yeah.
With the BBC, which I love, but clearly something went nightmarishly wrong with the ethics of the BBC, not just about Bashir and so on. They started paying sort of newsreaders 700,000 a year, ridiculous. And it just lost touch with license payers, and they thought they were members of some super rich media elite. And I think the media has a lot to answer for. I think the politicians have been the cult of the donor. There's a book in that, if I have the energy to do it. Cult of the political donor.
Yeah, we'll get you back on for sure. Yeah.
And it's quite hard often to find people who, I think school teachers you just cited, nurses, doctors, people who are decent, but I think there's something been very wrong with journalism now, politics. Isn't there? And we have to reassess what we all believe in as a country. And I think at the moment the left is far more likely to provide these kind of answers.
Yeah,
which is launching now a savage attack on the public domain, not just the state, but the public domain more broadly.
I totally agree. And I used to be a primary school teacher, and one of the things that primary schools were asked to do was to teach so-called British values. And I'm sure you'll know the four that Ofsted carry on about are democracy, the rule of law, tolerance for others, and liberty were the four we had to teach. And I look at the people at the top in government now, and I just think they've attacked democracy at every opportunity. The rule of law, they were just wantonly talking about breaking international law. Tolerance, are you kidding me? And I mean, liberty, okay, they bang on about liberty, but it just feels like the people at the top.
It's a brilliant point that they particularly, I do a lot of work in Islamophobia, so the Muslims are being accused of being against British values, but actually if you look at the Conservative government, which actually invented it legally, I think I'm right in saying this idea, it's a constructed idea of British values, very un-British idea, by the way.
None of those are British values.
But the government itself is flagrantly opposed to all the so-called British value, so-called British values it claims to support. This is a very interesting theme. I'm thinking of writing about this because it's really annoying.
Yeah,
just like I mean, it's not, and it's frightening because they have invented a concept which never existed. Tolerance, fairness, decency are very good things, and I like to think they are British, but they're also French and German. And,
exactly, they're universal.
Japanese.
Yeah, exactly. They're human values. Yeah.
Thank you. Precisely right. They're human values.
But it's frustrating being in. Sorry, please, sir.
When the Brits are at our best, that's hopefully what we do subscribe to.
That's right.
This lot don't. They really don't. And also not liberty. They're not. They're constantly clamping down and making it more difficult to protest. And
they hate being criticised. We've seen that. So just finally, then, the last question I have for you is about the future. At the very end of the book, in the conclusion, you talk about how we fight back. So just quickly, because there'll be people here who are who've been pulling their hair out for the last 4 or 5 years. And the most common question I ever get asked on my platform is, James, we know all of that. We know what the problems are. What are the solutions? How do we fight back? Because we feel totally powerless right now.
Yes, I have a chapter at the end where I make a certain number of suggestions about, protesting, but about holding politicians who lie to account, and there are various mechanisms in which we can do that through petitions and by writing letters and by asking MPs to explain themselves. I'm beginning to think, though, that that's almost too narrow. I think there needs to be a political movement.
Yeah, totally.
I'm very impressed by the work, I'm sure you are too, Peter Stefanovic at the Communications Workers Union, and that online campaign has got 20 million views. And I really support him. I think he's magnificent. And then you get other people fighting for the rule of law. Is it the Morn, the barrister?
Julian Morn, yeah.
He's immense work there.
The Good Law Project.
Flash out the truth about cronyism and potential corruption. And I think we have to invite people who think that we all accept that Britain has done wretched things in the past, but also there's a nobility about it, and it's a very big concept, Britain. It can embrace all sorts of different identities and values, actually. It's got worth something, and try and fight back about this very ugly alliance, which is between the super rich and clever manipulators who stir up hate in order to win political arguments, which is what the Conservative Party is in danger of turning into. And going back to your question about Boris Johnson, that absolutely wasn't the person I worked for 4 years at the Spectator at the start of the century.
Brilliant. Peter Oborne, thank you very much. I will make sure that the link is in the description to obviously your book and all of that. So thank you very much for being the first person for the book club Q&A. It's been a really interesting chat, and hopefully it will have inspired people listening to go out and basically not give up, because I think
we need to fight back. No, this is exactly right. We need to fight back. Decent people of whatever political belief, although I'm beginning to wonder how relevant that is anymore. Right. Decent people who believe in tolerance and fairness need to fight back, and that's our duty as human beings.
Totally. Peter, thank you very much.
Thanks.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.